Hello and good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad, Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Friday, November 20th marks 66 years since the United Nations first established World Children's Day. As the world continues to battle the COVID-19 pandemic, the head of UNICEF has warned that what began as a health crisis has now turned into a child rights crisis. Joining us on the show tonight, we have a representative from UNICEF. He is the representative of UNICEF in Malaysia and Brunei, Dr Rashed Mustafa Sarwar. Good evening, Rashed. Now, the pandemic has seen schools closed, parents out of work, and families growing under growing strain. All of this impacting children. Now, I'm wondering, have children's voices been lost in our decision-making about how to deal with the pandemic? Have we been child-centric in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you very much, Melisa and Sharaad. Good to be back. You very rightly mentioned that COVID-19 is a real child rights crisis because it's a global crisis and it's a child rights crisis. Poverty is rising, inequality is growing, and the pandemic has disrupted essential services, which made children more malnourished, made children more deprived from educational access and protection for children and young people. There is a myth that COVID-19 doesn't harm children, but the data from 87 countries says that 1 in 9 known COVID-19 infections are among children and young people under 20. So what we say, it's just a tip of the pandemic iceberg. And what we are talking about, every government is trying their best, but still long way to go to reach the pre-COVID situation, the pre-COVID condition for every child, every children in the country.
Thanks for mentioning the pre-COVID situation. You know, this is the 60th anniversary, as you like, of this special day where we focus our attention on achieving goals that are related to children. What, until the point of the pandemic, had we achieved for children globally? What would you say are the highlights, and to what extent will these be recoverable once the pandemic eases and we return to normal life?
UNICEF, together with the government for the last 75 years, have been trying hard and achieving a very good result on reducing malnutrition, increasing access to basic education, quality education, improve health, and participation for the young people. But then this COVID-19 and last 1 year almost really brought us back. We call it averting a lost COVID generation. Means it's a generation lost due to worsening nutrition, malnutrition, due to access of education. And unfortunately, Malaysia is not out of that global phenomena.
Right. I'm glad that you pointed out malnutrition because, you know, I want to talk a little bit about the impact. Household poverty and food insecurity rates have increased as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown. And because of that, the quality of children's diets have gone down. Malnutrition rates will go up. I'm wondering, Rashed, you know, this is in childhood is when children are growing. Are you concerned that stunting rates, that wasting rates would go up even after the pandemic has eased? Can this period have a lasting impact on children?
Thank you, Melisa. Yes, you have seen our first report on family on the age, and then the last one, the second one that we published in October. We have seen that still 10% of B40 families are having still 10% lower income than pre-COVID crisis. And about 70% of them has difficulties to buy quality food, and the consumption of protein, consumption of nutritional food in their daily food basket are interrupted. And you know that when wasting and stunting, we already had an alarming scenario pre-COVID. I believe that we will have even higher level of malnutrition, unfortunately, among children. And this is not a disease that you can cure it in a 1 day, 1 month, 1 year. This has a longer impact on their brain development, impact of their psychological development and physical development. And it has very much linked with education, success in education, success in finding proper job and in the whole life. So yes, it's really a very longer impact than we can even imagine.
Rashed, one of the things, of course, that's happened is that schools that could have been or have played a role of being a locus for intervention in the lives of children now are closed or have gone online, and we've lost the ability to make the intervention through schools. So do you think that this was too drastic a measure? Should we have been much more restrained in the decision to close schools because we lost an avenue to reach children?
You are right, Sharaad. Children need community. Children need socialization. They need to talk to their peers. But on the other hand, we also have to look at their health and their safety. So I could not tell you whether having the school open would be beneficial, would be good for the children. But what I would like to say that giving them a proper access to education, and we are talking about online education, we see that that 2 out of 5 children have difficulties to have access to online education. And the last research shows that 1 out of 5 children have lost interest in school, while 7% of upper secondary age children are no longer ready to go to school. So we really having a problem, a trouble of educating our children, whether they're in the school or whether you connect them to virtual education. When we say that staying home is maybe physically maybe safe to get infected from COVID-19. On the other hand, staying home had a lot of other implications. The psychological well-being of the children has deteriorated a lot.
Rashed, so if I could jump in there, you know, before COVID engulfed the world, we had pockets of children displaced because of war. We think of Yemen, for instance, where there's a terrible war and the toll on children is tremendously high. In those kinds of situations, have children been resilient? Have they been able to bounce back? Despite the nutritional issues or the lack of schooling and whatever they had suffered during the period of displacement, were they able to catch up later on?
Yes, I think the most important is that psychological well-being and mental health for the children and their continuous interest in education. And if you get a proper venue, proper platform, proper arena to study, children could catch up. But then the issue is the malnutrition, and issue is psychological well-being and interest to the education. So if we can tackle these two things, psychological well-being and their health, in a proper intervention, in a priority intervention on education, bring children back to school and back to education, I think we could catch up. But this needs a very strong prioritization and policy from the government, from the parents, and from all of us.
Could I ask you to be more specific? What kind of child-centric policy intervention would you like to see so that the psychological well-being of children and also their education is taken care of during this difficult time?
Our second Family on the Age report says that the government intervention on financial support to the families has some very, very good impact on their well-being. However, it's partial. What we say that education access has to be secured. If children do not have access, 70% of the children are accessing or were accessing through a mobile device, either a mobile phone or a small screen. That's very much harmful for their eyes. They will get tired. So we need to make sure that children have better device, better enabling environment to tap into online education. And also psychological well-being is very much depend on the parents, a proper parenting as well. Because we have seen that globally during this COVID period, a lot of domestic violence, a lot of violence against children, stress. We have seen increased number of child pregnancy and all. So this is a very complicated, very complex issues, and I think we have to be very much serious about supporting our children and bringing them back to the normal life.
Rashed, you know, last minute with you. Are there any silver linings? I mean, if you had to say something about World Children's Day that isn't about COVID, it isn't about these reversals, is there anything positive that we can look to today? Yeah,
for sure. I think that the way that government has been handling the COVID, the whole situation, I think is commendable. And I think if we compare many other countries, the government of Malaysia have been doing very good job. We also have seen efforts to provide online platform for education. We are very happy that the government is very much open in sharing information, very much open to listening and discussing the issues. It's not really that, okay, we are good, we are very much in partnering with the government. That's very, very commendable. We also see that the numbers in Malaysia are better compared to other countries. I would not bring the numbers of the other countries, but there are many things that we could see in a positive note. But the World Children's Day is a day when we say that child rights is the most important topic, and children are the not object but subject for better investment.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for celebrating World Children's Day with us and for sharing your insights. It's a pleasure speaking with you on the show. Thank you. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be back with more on Consider This. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation on how the management of the pandemic has affected our children. Sharmila Sekaran joins us now. She is the chairperson of the NGO Voice of the Children. Sharmila, what do you think have been the realities of childhood in 2020? Have children become collateral damage in our fight against this virus?
I think certainly not having the right focus, which is a child-centered focus, has meant that a lot of our children have become collateral damage. A lot of our children have really not been put at the forefront in the fight against this pandemic. In fact, I think the focus has been on containing the virus as well and the spread of it, as well as on economy. But our children have been left behind, a lot of them.
Sharmila, do you think that that was kind of inevitable considering the nature of the pandemic? The vulnerable segments of our society were actually older people, people with comorbidities already sick from other diseases, so that our focus naturally tended towards them as a segment of the population, and also the fact that children live with their parents and their families, and if the families are not doing well in terms of livelihood, that they would be impacted too. So the children have not been the absolute focus. Isn't that a kind of natural consequence of the broad nature of this crisis?
Quite, but then, because we do not have a system that addresses these issues, and child protection is certainly something that we have not been looking at properly as a nation for many, many years. As a result of that, the initial response, of course, is to address what, the entire world was gripped with, a very unique situation and a very tragic situation of having to shut the whole world down. But a lot of countries were able to very quickly pull their socks up and get going in terms of child protection. And that is something that we failed to do. If you remember right at the start, the first thing we did in terms of children and the vulnerable people was to shut down Talian Kasih, which would have been the wrong response. In fact, what should have been done, any entity which is focused on protection and welfare would have realized that they are an essential service and would have very quickly mustered the right kind of SOPs and processes and garnered support from private citizens as well to ensure that the vulnerable in society, children being a large component of it, were protected and their needs were addressed. Instead, we went the other way and we decided that they were not essential services, and so children and the people who are vulnerable were left behind.
Right. Sharmila, often when we talk about children and the impact of the pandemic and the management of the pandemic has had on children, we focus on the education, the school closures, we focus on the interrupted learning, and also the digital divide. I'm wondering also about this crisis of childcare. Many parents struggling to balance their responsibilities for childcare and paid employment, and a subsequent, and a big proportion of that, it's a disproportionate burden has been placed on women for that balance. What have you observed, and how have we responded in terms of childcare that you'd like to see us do better?
So, one of the issues is, you're absolutely right, and it's not just purely childcare, it's also parents becoming educators, because when children are learning at home, the parents are the ones who have to discipline the child and make sure they're sat doing their homework at home and their online classes, if they're able to access their online classes, while balancing their work, while looking after younger children who may not have classes to attend. So you're absolutely right. Parents, and in particular the mothers, have had an overwhelming burden in this regard. We really need to start thinking about the way we expect or what we want from our society. We need to map out what we'd like to see our society look like and work backwards from there. And what we need to see a society look like is a society that is able to work together, collaborate together, and not just leave one or two people or one or two agencies handling the entire burden when something like this happens. So,
Sharmila, if I can jump in there, it seems to me what you're saying is that the deficits we had already baked into our system before the crisis just were we had the Band-Aid ripped off and exposed our vulnerabilities or the deficits in our system. The question is, in good times, we didn't deal with those problems. In a crisis, are we even less likely to deal with these problems?
Absolutely, because we just don't have the methodology, the processes, and even the people. So if our welfare officers are already overworked, in the good times, as you rightly put it, then, when you have an influx of people who need extra help or more specialized help, we have even fewer people. It's exactly the same with our healthcare services. If you don't invest in your healthcare services during the good times, in a crisis situation, you just don't have the doctors and the hospital beds and what have you necessary to address that the crisis. And that's exactly what's happened with regards to children during this time.
Sharmila, can we talk a little bit about the role of NGOs and how the role that they've played during the past few months in terms of child protection and child welfare? You pointed to certain gaps that welfare officers may not be able to reach everyone, or pointed to shutdowns in Talian Kasih and the like. What role have NGOs played to fill that gap?
So many NGOs, one of the good things that has happened is the NGOs realized that they among themselves needed to collaborate. So while you have NGOs kind of like focusing on certain areas or certain issues, we realized that, for example, an NGO that deals with refugees also needs to collaborate with an NGO that works on children's issues or women's issues, and so forth. So there was a wider or greater collaboration among the NGOs of them reaching out, so that we were able to cover more ground. We heard of cases, for example, that were happening in Kuttan, and there's no way, because of in the height of this whole thing during the MCO period for the 6 weeks, March until April, we would not have been able to address an issue in Kuttan, say, for example. And so you could reach out to NGOs who were in that area, who were then able to cover that base. But over and above that, I think it also, again, exposed the lack of coordination and collaboration between NGOs and the government services, because initially we were even held back from assisting the government. And we had MPs, members of parliament, we had, the social workers reaching out and saying, we need extra hands, but it was really hard to get that, you have to get permission from the police to leave your space. Your homes, and it was very hard to get that. So the initial process of getting started at the outset was quite difficult, and it again showed the need for welfare and government agencies to collaborate with NGOs, to reach out to NGOs. We do have child protectors, or rather assistant child protectors among NGO workers, some of whom get called in, many of whom do not.
Sharmila, if I could sort of jump in here, it seems very interesting because there is this debate. The MCO period and the problems there aside, one of the critiques of government is that in many ways it outsources to NGOs things it doesn't want to do, doesn't want to fund, couldn't be bothered, and incompetent or otherwise to deal with. What do you think should be the balance? I mean, should we strive to build a system run essentially by government, competent and holistic in its approach, or should we have a mix of government and NGOs in any kind of future building back scenario or building back better scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I think a hybrid is good and does work. You don't want an overly burdened government service. And NGOs are able to address certain issues which perhaps the government agencies aren't able to address and get into. So I think there is a possibility of having a hybrid situation and for us to strike that balance. But what it does need is for a lot more oversight in terms of who does what, and it has to be very clear as to who has what role. Ultimately, the government has to appreciate its role in terms of welfare and provision of welfare. They may not be able to fund the entirety of it, but there are different ways of crowdfunding, of leaning on corporations, CSR programs, that kind of thing. But the NGOs can and should be having a little bit more of an open relationship with the government and vice versa. Very often it is personality-based, which it should not be. It should be issue-based, it should be needs-based, and not personality-based.
All right, Sharmila, coming back to what you said about creating child-centric policies, I'm wondering, what would you like to see going forward? I mean, what has happened in the past few months, but as we move forward, as we deal with this pandemic, what would you like to see specifically, particularly in terms of not just protecting child rights, but putting that at the center and the heart of our response to this pandemic?
Quite. So I think there needs to be three things that we need to address. There needs to be a paradigm shift. Children are very often treated like, for example, a punctuation mark in a sentence, very often forgotten or misplaced. And if you forget or misplace a punctuation mark, it changes, or you could misread an entire sentence. It changes the tone and the meaning of the sentence. Similarly, with children, if we do not appreciate how important they are in society, do not ask why the society is messed up. Do not ask why things are going wrong. It is very directly linked to the fact that we have forgotten where the punctuations are. And it is the children. They are fundamental to any society because they are the future. So we need to have that paradigm shift. We need to prioritize child protection and have very proper and clear procedures of reporting, of monitoring, of evaluation, of identifying the children at risk. We also need to enhance our education system for them. Many children are being left behind because they were just not able to go to school or be educated during this process. We need to rethink what we mean by education. We need literacy. We need scientific literacy, legal literacy, financial literacy, quite apart from language literacy. And we also need to address how we're handling children who are in conflict with the law, children who are in centers having been charged or sentenced for sometimes things which are not really high-level offenses. And we really need to rethink about the way we handle these children to ensure that they can actually be in society and participate in society and become useful members of a community, rather than be labeled as juvenile offenders or child offenders or whatever it is.
Or delinquents. Thank you so much, Sharmila, for bringing up those points, very valid points, and thank you for sharing your insights with us tonight. That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad, Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night.